Welcome to the Sultans of Sales podcast. I'm your host, Jamil Pendleton. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm so excited for today's guest, Dr. Scott Sigman, orthopedic private practice surgeon outside of Boston. Doc, thank you so much for carving out some time for me, for us, for the audience. Tell us about yourself.
First of all, Jay, it's a pleasure to be here, man. I love how we meet, this LinkedIn platform. Everybody sort of gets to know each other, and you reached out to me. And so I've been following you. So I think it's fantastic to be here. I greatly appreciate it. Everybody that knows me knows that I usually go with my little shtick, which is, I am the original opioid-sparing orthopedic surgeon, healer of knees and shoulders, left and right. Hashtag follow the fro, host of the Ortho Show, and chief medical officer and founder of Ortho Laser Orthopedic Laser Centers.
Beautiful.
Yeah, man.
It's amazing.
Oh, it's fantastic. Fantastic. Great to be here.
Fantastic. And so I told you this off mic, I have curly hair. In fact, I played soccer, and anytime I'd score a goal, everybody would throw it up and just make it go crazy. And obviously I lost it in my mid-20s, but I love to see the fro, the curly hair. It's just
it's actually nice. It started off as a joke, amongst friends and stuff, and then it just sort of took on a life of its own. And it's actually just part of my brand, man. I walk around, I'm really excited. I'm going down to Nashville tomorrow for the annual sports meeting. AOSSM and Anna came together. So this will be the first society meeting where we're going to get to shake hands again and see people. So we're super excited about that. And every time I go to one of these meetings, somebody will tap me on the shoulder and say, "Hey man, I follow the fro. I love that opioid stuff you're doing." I'm like, "All right, thanks, brother. Great to be here." Yeah.
I love the brand. I love the fro. It's amazing. I'm all in on it. And I'm a fan of yours as well. So you mentioned following me on LinkedIn. That's flattering because I do the same, for you. And I love a lot of the content that you put out. Can we talk about the opioid sparing? Because that's such an important, for you to hitch your brand to it and your practice to that in a lot of ways. Talk about where that started, kind of the origin or the genesis of that.
Yeah, it was just such a frustrating time. And the fact that the entire medical industry got caught up in this cycle of pain management that was created by the pharmaceutical, big pharma teams that were present at the time, and how, I look back on those days, and we would be passing out 60 and 90 pills, and we had no idea. We were just taught, this is how you do things. It wasn't evidence-based at all. We were told that opioids were relatively inexpensive. They weren't addictive. You have a responsibility to make sure that your patients are out of pain, and you got to do this because orthopedic surgery hurts. And so we would do it. And all we knew was that there were all these people that kept calling for refills, and some of them were truly belligerent, and others were having terrible problems. And then next thing you know, we're hearing about these deaths that were occurring from kids that would undergo an ACL surgery, and 6 months later, they were dead of an opioid overdose. And it got to a point in about 2014 where it was just unbearable. And it was just something that I looked at it. There was one patient I had, for example, who had regular shoulder surgery. He was already on narcotics before surgery, and then he was demanding that we give additional, medication. He was going to report me to the Board of Registration of Medicine, and then 3 months later, he drove his car into a wall and he died. And it was just an awakening for me at that point to say that what we're doing isn't right. We have to do something better. We have to change the paradigm of what we're doing, applying medication to our patients. And that's where it started for me. And then there was a medication called liposomal bupivacaine, also known as Exparel. It was a long-acting anesthetic, and we started using it. And the changes were profound in what we were seeing, the improvements in the patient's outcomes, and they weren't requiring them narcotics as much. That was really done in the inpatient setting. And then we pushed it to the outpatient setting. And basically, I've been on the podium ever since, And we've done well, Jay, but it's still not fixed. There's still lots of doctors that are writing multiple prescriptions for multiple medications. So we're doing our best, but there's not lots of new medicines that are coming out now, which are awesome. In addition to the long-acting anesthetics, we have Now there's a new opioid, which is called Dysuvia, which is sublingual, which you can give, which actually doesn't get the patients high. It gives them an even pain amount and reduces the overall need for opioids. We're using this medication called IV meloxicam or Enjazo, which is a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory. So we're using all of these multimodal approaches now, right, and we're really making a difference in these patients' lives. Doctors are listening and patients are listening.
And that's awesome. Thank you so much for just leading the charge there on behalf of the patient community, because a lot of people as they age, they need care, they need surgical intervention, and there is pain postoperatively, and there are things that need to be done. So it's awesome to know that there are people like you out there and that are prescribing these, pardon the pun, things that are going to have a true impact. So I have two questions, and kind of you decide. So are you working hand in hand with industry in this mission? And I guess second follow-up question would be, how is this impacting patient-reported outcomes?
So the answer is yes. I lend my voice to hand-picked industry and things that I find are going to be real game changers and really, revolutionize the way in which post-operative, perioperative pain management is handled. And so there are a number of pharmaceutical companies that I work with specifically to lend my voice to be able to sort of generate the change in the paradigm that we're looking for. And there's one doctor in particular, Dr. Asif Ilyas, who started the Rothman Opioid Foundation. And one of the major principles of the Rothman Opioid Foundation is to really present evidence-based outcomes. So your question was a great one. Like, how is this affecting patient-reported outcomes? And at the end of the day, what we're showing now and what's coming out in paper after paper is that you can safely and effectively take patients through pain, through surgery. You can reduce their pain without opioids by providing opioid stewardship, only use the opioids that are required. We're not completely eliminating them, but what we are doing is reducing the need for them. And we can then demonstrate through pain scores and reported outcomes that these patients are doing just as well with fewer opioid-related adverse events, fewer readmissions to the hospital, all of those things that can be quite costly on the backside of the epidemic, to be able to make this happen. So great question. And the answer is yes, we are doing that on a daily basis.
Well, thank you. And just a follow-up to that is just, my fear is as the payers or whomever gets involved on a more larger scale, and they just, okay, we got an opioid crisis here, so we're just going to rip the Band-Aid off without thoughtful foresight, kind of what you're talking about working on just what is needed and things that you've seen anecdotally, but also maybe some data that's coming to make this change a lasting one. Because, I got to say, spine surgery has been my world, but I see this lens as the entire surgery, the entire healthcare world. Like this is maybe in orthopedics is our kind of common denominator, but I mean, it's much bigger than that.
Yeah. And I want to be very clear, I'm not one of these, anti-opioids for get them off the planet. I mean, we have a responsibility for the patients that have chronic pain. We started a lot of these patients on medications because we thought it was the right thing for them. There are a large group of patients that can actually function on a daily basis while still on opioids. So we can't neglect them. You can't stop them cold turkey. We need to provide education to our primary care doctors, to our pain specialists that will allow these patients to either remain on the medications or come up with a strategy to help get them off. What I am, and my main mission is to try and prevent the next wave of the opioid epidemic that will be the loss of life or create another wave of patients that are chronically addicted to medications that don't need to be.
Yeah, thank you. That's beautiful. And I'm glad to know you. Proud to hear about what your mission is, because that's a very important one and a critical one. Let's talk you mentioned primary care physicians, and that actually brought up a conversation that I just had yesterday, with a resident who's going into fellowship, and he's looking at different fellowships, and he's asking for my advice, which is humbling. This is also that time where I'm now giving advice to surgeons, and they're younger than me. So it's been this when I started out, I was just green, trying to just spew out all the things that I knew to these older surgeons who were just laughing probably on the inside. And then now this guy's calling me because we had a really good interaction. He's being very intentional about where he wants to take his fellowship, and he's an orthopedic spine surgeon. But he was also asking, he was also thinking about not just where he wants to go to fellowship, but like how he can start to create relationships with the primary care physicians that would then be a fuel for his practice growth, which I thought was brilliant for, 29-year-old kid to already to kind of get there. So long-winded question as a backdrop to it. How have you created relationships, throughout your career in that regard?
Yeah, I mean that's a really good question. So the primary care is, your job most of the time you belong to a network, you're part of the process, and the basic easy things to do, or you hang up your shingle and you run around shaking hands. But ultimately, what I would say to that doctor is that if you want to be the specialist of the specialists, which is a Matthew Ray Scott quote, who's a dear friend of mine and the brand
He's
man,
great.
the bearded one. If you want to be the specialist of the specialist, you don't have to sit back and wait to shake the PCP's hands. Introduce yourself to the community, to the people in which you're going to be serving, and create a brand, create a message. What is it about yourself that's going to be unique? And then that's the message you get out. It goes to the primary cares, but it also goes to your patients. And then these patients are requesting you. The window period of the PCP referring them in is important too. But at the end of the day, and what's your message going to be? Is it going to be patient education? Is it going to be opioid sparing? Is it going to be the latest, surgical technique that's not present in the community that you're bringing? But right. Then you use this thing called the computer machine, and you start developing a brand. So Joe Mullings is another dear friend of mine. It's like, great. Joe always provides amazing recommendations. It's like, start following the 30 neurosurgeons or spine surgeons that you think are the most prominent, right? Mm-hmm. And just keep watching and seeing what they do, and then you start liking their comments, and then you become part of their ecosystem. And then
that's right.
Once you're in that ecosystem, then you're sitting at the table of innovation with these powerful, iconic people that then you're part of their community and you're represented. So all of those things going together. Just don't knock on the PCP's doors, but come up with a strategy of your professional brand that's going to set you apart from the people in your community.
Well said. As a quick side note, well, I guess three things: the bearded one and the bald one, Joe, and Matthew Ray Scott and Joe Mullings. I both reached out to them, individually when I was looking, when I was faced with a career decision. Right, I had lost my job through restructuring, and both of them have provided such sage wisdom, such confidence in. And it's starting to materialize into some of the content that you're seeing, and even in the title that I was given by my boss. And so I thank those gentlemen. They're incredible, and they're great for our industry. So you mentioned one more piece on the PCP. Do you provide? So I totally get you where you're coming from in terms of building a brand and a message and sending that out to the community, right? And helping them help you. What about post-operatively? Is there like a dossier, or is there like a patient success story, or whatever that you kind of routinely provide? Do you think that that's helpful? Kind of just so the primary care physician, I guess, would see it. And then secondly, is that something industry, would you be okay with industry helping you there? I did it a lot as a rep for NuVasive, with XLIF was a kind of an innovative thing and a new thing, trying to help the spine surgeons, right, share what they're doing and why to those primary care physicians. But I'm just curious on your perspective there.
Yeah, I mean, I've been a big fan of patient testimonials, always have. I mean, you have to make sure if you're shooting video, obviously, that you have consent from the patient. Specifically on the video that you're applying, you want to try and make sure that there's no patient information that from a HIPAA perspective that's going to be shown as well. But, when you're doing things that are unique and your outcomes are unique, then I think it's a responsibility to be able to let other people know what those outcomes are. And you could certainly get on a pulpit and talk about it yourself, but why not have the patients that have been through it and experience such, improvements in
Right.
their lives tell the story, right? And so do you send those, do I send those to the primary care doctor directly? No, but most of the doctors in the community are part of the social media platforms as well, and so they can
Right.
identify those. And then ultimately, for me, the most powerful way in which that I have drawn, patients. So I do some very unique shoulder rotator cuff surgery and an opioid sparing approach using an implant that not everybody was using early on. Sort of we jokingly called it the cow patch, which is the Regeniten bovine bioinductive implant. But these patients would go to church, they go to work, and they would just talk about their
Talk about it.
experience. And
Right.
then next thing you know, I'm getting patients from surrounding communities who are scheduled for surgery someplace else who bring in their MRI and they say, I heard about the cow patch and am I a candidate and I'd like you to do my surgery. And that
Wow.
doesn't happen overnight. I mean, it takes a while to get to critical mass to the point where, you don't have to worry about patients knocking on the door. But I think there's a larger thing, Jay, that you're bringing up, which is the relationship between surgeon and trusted medical device representative. And for me in particular, I've had very special relationships, with my medical device reps, and having that confidence in knowing that the back table is taken care of.
Yep.
And then, because you spend so much time, you become friends as well. And it's a special relationship. So whenever I hear anybody out, oh, we don't need reps in the room and all this other, I'm like, that is absolutely ridiculous. I was just joking around. I was on Becker's podcast earlier today, and we were talking like, what's sort of the medical device? What do you see in promising device? And I was like, well, let me ask you a question. When you get into an Uber, right, and you see the guy has a AAA map, are you going to let him drive you around, or are you going to go with the guy with the GPS, right? You're going with the guy with the GPS every time.
That's great, man.
So it's like, if you're going to do a hip replacement or a spine fusion or, a knee replacement, the idea of all of these amazing technologies that we have, robotics or patient-specific instrumentation or artificial intelligence, those technologies are creeping into the operating room, and they should be, because I think at the end of the day, it will bear out that there's going to be improvement in patient outcomes. And you can't do those things without having qualified representation to help all of us together as a team work together for patient outcomes at the end of the day.
Wow. Thank you. That's, I think there's going to be a lot of people that have either been in your OR or another OR that are going to just love what you just said, because I think that the term vendor, and there's even like a hashtag going around Instagram, like Red Hat Crew, and it's just like this. I mean, my first job was our rep room was literally across from the morgue. So I kind of early on realized like our place in the pecking order of the hospital ecosystem.
Yeah.
But,
sure.
I mean, are there some procedures that I didn't need to be a part of? Absolutely. Right. I mean, I remember a couple of different times there was a flight that I had to catch to get to whatever it was, a sales meeting, a surgeon training. And the doc was like, go, we've got this. Like, you're good. Like, don't miss the flight because of this. And, so I had, obviously that wasn't the first surgery, but had a wonderful staff that would help, kind of facilitate that. Here's what we use. Here's the number of screws and all that stuff. That happened maybe once. So it over a long career. But yeah, and there's some procedures that I don't have a huge part of, but it's more the ones where, hey, you don't think you're going to be needed, but then stuff hits the fan.
Yeah, man. Or like, what about my tech rep knows the Arthrex equipment better than the Arthrex rep, because sometimes, somebody's not here, not there, and it's going to be that case instead of somebody else's. So being able to cross over and still help in the community, the operating room, is a team approach. For, again, at the end of the day, the knee and the shoulder are attached to a patient. And so therefore, you got to make sure that you're healing the entire patient. So having everybody on the team makes a huge difference.
Yeah, no, that's good. And so how do you, I love this. I'm glad you said team, because I'm a big team guy. I think that teams are very, very important. I've been blessed to be a part of many great teams throughout my life, starting with, soccer and sports, and then kind of now into this world of being part of the surgical team, like an extension of surgeons teams. What is how does that develop? Kind of any thoughts around the team aspect, whether it be in your OR or at ortho laser, which I definitely wanted to ask about, wherever you want to go there.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about trust. It's developing, a mutual respect. It's the same thing. So it's a doctor-patient relationship, the mutual respect of them understanding and having the confidence in you as a surgeon to be able to carefully and safely and effectively move them through surgery and have a good result. And then it's the team that is behind the scenes, whether it's the anesthesia team in advance that also has to follow and prescribe to the ideals of an opioid-sparing approach that we're doing. It's the communication of the nurses to the patient to make sure that they're all on the same message as we go through. And then having in the operating room a team of circulators and scrub technicians and medical device reps all moving around in a perfect orchestra to be able to make sure that everything is in place and that you have a successful outcome with as little stress as possible.
That's awesome. So thank you for that, because it's good to hear. I would agree. It's teamwork, it's trust, communication, and those things are built over time, right? It's not a marathon, not a sprint. Let's talk about ortho laser.
Yeah, man.
You mentioned that. I wanted to give you an opportunity to share what that is and kind of in your words.
Yeah, it was born out of my opioid-sparing, philosophy, my opioid stewardship, which is, seeking out alternative options to opioids, and that's where laser came into play. And it's interesting, I always start the conversation the same way. I'm like, all right, Jay, dude, do you believe in photosynthesis? This is not a trick question. Do you believe in photosynthesis?
Yes.
Of course you do, right? The sun comes down, the grass grows, the leaves on the tree grow, etc. So
absolutely,
photosynthesis is what we do. What is it? It's light coming in to a plant, creating energy, and something happens. Same thing for vitamin D, right? We know vitamin D, the active metabolite of vitamin D, only way it happens is if you're in sunlight. Why is that? Because we're a species that lives on a planet with a sun. So then, I sort of take the skeptics and I say, well, why it should not come as a surprise that a species living on a planet with a sun in its deepest genetic code would have sensitivity to sunlight. It seems natural to me. And so the basic science behind laser is well borne out, very well proven. You can take fibroblasts, put them on a petri dish, just scratch the thing, you put laser over top of them with the right wavelength, and the fibroblasts go crazy and they come across the scratch line. You can increase the temperature, increase mitochondrial production of ATP. You reduce these things called inflammasomes, and you can block interleukin-6 and all of these cytokines that are pro-inflammatory. That's all been shown. It is not, it's not like a pie in the sky type thing. The clinical studies in the past have lagged, but they are coming around now as a classification of lasers is better understood. And the bottom line is that this laser is a very powerful anti-inflammatory. And it was that notion that I said, I want to, start using laser. I tried it in my clinical practice. And I had, at the time, 11 orthopedic surgeons. And of course, 11 orthopedic surgeons typically have 11 different opinions. So rather than going upstream, I decided to set up an ortho laser center. I trademarked the name. I bought 3 lasers, and I opened up the first clinic 2.5 years ago.
Where was that?
It's in Chelmsford, Massachusetts, which is right next to where I practice. So it was a 5-minute drive from the office, and the patients would go get laser. And we were getting really good results, super happy. And then the laser distributor knocks on my door, who sold me the lasers, and said, this is a unique model. This is not something that we've done before. But, we want to franchise this idea across the country. We want to do that with you. So we went through the process and went through all the paperwork that's required through the FTC and all of that. And right now we have 9 centers that are open, 23 that are committed, and we're getting calls every day from around the country from, interested parties. Our safety and efficacy is outstanding. These are FDA cleared lasers. And at the end of the day, Jay, we use it for 3 ways. One is for acute injuries. So for an old guy like yourself, when you roll your ankle playing hockey, you can come in, we'll laser you up. You'll be back on the ice in a couple of weeks. If you break a bone, if you have a hamstring tear, all of these things are exceptionally treated well, near 100% efficacy with the laser. We use it perioperatively because what surgery? It's iatrogenic acute inflammation. right? We're causing trauma. So we put these
Absolutely.
patients under laser, dramatic reduction in bruising, inflammation, swelling, faster recoveries. And then the third way we use it is for, all of the weekend warrior inflammatory stuff, tennis elbow, plantar
Oh my
fasciitis,
gosh, that's me.
osteoarthritis. Yeah, I can see you smiling. So yeah, that's all that stuff. It works great for laser as well. So those are the way in which we use it. And it's been a remarkable trajectory. I mean, obviously we got our approval to start the franchise November of 19, right? So three
Yeah,
months three
yeah,
months later, that wasn't great. But at the end of the day, we've come out of the pandemic very strong with a lot of real excitement around this alternative treatment option. So it's a way for, I'll be honest, it's interesting. We were talking medical device reps. So there's a few things that are great. Number one is that we're really helping patients, right? We provide
sure,
in these communities in which ortho laser is coming in, it's an alternative treatment option. It can help to reduce the need for opioids and
right,
perioperatively and all these things. It's a patient pay model because it's not accepted by insurance at this point. So
right,
patients have to pay, but it's an extra revenue generator for surgeons, which coming out of the pandemic is exciting for
right.
them. And then we have a lot of non-physician equity owners that just happen to be medical device reps or medical device distributors. And the way in which the model can be set up, you can set up a holding company above the franchise where you can have non-licensed physicians that can have equity ownership in these franchises. And that's
Nice,
been a really impressive model for us because, as
absolutely.
you guys, Jay, had the black books, right? You know everybody in your territory. You
Oh,
know who
cool.
the innovative key opinion leaders are. You're the ones that can knock on the door and this is the guy that I know would do the laser. The other guy don't even talk to him. And
Right,
so, so what we're seeing and what these people are doing, is they want to develop area development agreements. They'll take, I want Chicago and I
yep,
want 5 centers in Chicago. And we say, great, open up one, and then we'll sign an area development agreement for the other 4. You go pick out the docs that you think are going to be the ones, set up shop, and now you're outside of just receiving commission. Now you have equity ownership in a reliable form of potential income. It's really pretty cool.
that's awesome.
It really is. So we're getting a lot of interest from that category as well.
What about private equity? Have they been all over this? I mean, that's kind of maybe some of the aforementioned non-physician equity owners, or
Yeah, I mean, we would anticipate that's going to be coming down the road. I think we need
yeah,
a few more open, successful. Right now we've been bootstrapping. We're really proud of that. And what's great is because we have, we have the technology. The technology is baked into the system, so we own it. And so, if you think about most franchises, if you're going to set up, for example, like an urgent care franchise, it's like
yep,
1.5 million bucks. You got to buy tables, X-ray
startup,
machines,
yep,
an E-cage, and lab stuff. You buy 3 lasers, some computers, some desks. We brand it out exactly. It's the
ready
overall
to go.
amount of money required to open up an ortho laser franchise is really not bad, especially if you're partnering with 5 or 6 orthopedic surgeons.
Right.
They've got the ability to have some cash to sign on. So we're seeing that there's a lot of interest for that reason. The orthopedic surgeons are kind of psyched as well as the reps.
Yeah. Well, so, okay, dig into the patient experience. Like, how does it work? So they come in and, like, how do you identify candidates for laser? Can they just roll up to the strip mall and just walk in? And I mean, or is it prescriptive? Like, how does the patient process happen?
Yeah, all great questions. So we had actually advised our franchisees not to seek out retail space because obviously that's
No,
even more expensive per square foot. We're not a walk-in clinic. We don't want walk-in patients.
got
If
it.
you're coming in with elbow pain, I want to make sure you don't have an osteosarcoma of your capitellum. So we need some form of medical record, right? You can have an MRI report, you can have a PCP report, you can have another specialist report, and then under HIPAA controlled process, they send us in the reports. Myself or my nurse practitioner will review the medical records, and then we prescribe the appropriate laser treatment. Now, what I do in my clinical practice is that instead of writing a therapy prescription, I'll write a therapy prescription and laser, for example. And I have a prescription pad right in my office. The patients then go out and get checked out by my secretary, and they call over to Ortho Laser. They get their first appointment. It's 6 sessions typically for acute injuries and up to 10 to 12 for more chronic injuries. Then the patients set up their own appointments after that. each appointment's 15 to 20 minutes. You're in, you're out. You know, in my center, we have 4 lasers. In Milwaukee, we have 6. So, you know,
Nice.
the volume of patients that can roll through is reliable for the patient. So they're not spending a tremendous amount of time. And then they're free and clear after their laser session to pretty much go and do what they want to do for the day. There's not like they have to lay in bed or wait for the injection to work or
Right,
anything
right.
along those lines.
So, okay, forgive me in advance for asking this question, but I feel like I'm going to appreciate your answer, as will the audience. I mean, there's been a lot of bad press, I think, lately around, you know, surgeons. You mentioned Becker's, right? I mean, they have a great list of email that comes out, and usually one or two of those hyperlinks are about some surgeon with DOJ and involving star clause or whatever. You're a private practice physician who, as you said, you've got therapies that you treat your patients for, but you're also financially involved in this ortho laser company. How does that work? Where are you at with that? It's completely on the up and up. You mentioned your mission being to spare patients from opioid. I completely, in my heart of heart, believe that. I'm just asking a question that maybe somebody else has, like that
No,
same
so
question, that doesn't
these
understand the
100%.
dynamics.
Yeah, 100%. No, you're asking, that's a very good question. It's an important question. So, you know, the Stark laws are really focused specifically about Medicare, CMS, Medicare,
Yep.
and Medicaid. And the Stark laws were basically put in place to state that if you have a designated health service, which is radiology, it's labs, it's DME, durable medical goods, it can be, you know, MRIs, these sorts of things. There's a list of about 10 of them that are considered designated health services. And you can only generate so much money by doing self-referral of those things within your practice. And you got to make sure that nobody else is referring into the stuff that you own so that you're not generating additional income that way. Laser. So what is physical therapy when it is concerned, you know, to CMS and to Medicare? It's anything that has a CPT code for physical therapy. So laser does not have a CPT code. So laser is not considered a designated health service according to Medicare and CMS. We do not charge Medicare, CMS, or any commercial insurance payer for this product. So therefore, because it's a patient pay model, except for maybe 1 or 2 states, you can legally self-refer to a facility that you own to provide care for these patients because we're not charging insurances. Now, there's a few states. Florida has a self-referral law. California has a self-referral law, and so there has to be some, you know, some legal issues that you have to be addressing there. But for the most part, you are legally allowed to be able to send patients to this facility that you own without concern for kickbacks or anything along those lines.
Right. Well, thank you for answering that head on. I mean, it makes sense to me. And you know, if I'm a patient, that totally vibes with, look, the goal of surgery is not surgery, right? It's recovery. It's getting back your life. It's using your limbs and your back and whatever it is, your knees, your shoulders. It's using them again in a way that is, you know, makes the most sense. And then going through that, one of the hallmarks of my career has been, I've always been really fascinated and led with disruptive technology, right? The technology that's going to help that patient do better, because if I can do that, then the surgeon's going to have a better experience, right? As will the patient, and their practice grows, and then my business grows, right? So I was the Jerry Maguire of spine reps. I had 3 surgeons, Dr. Sigman. They used me for everything. And because we went deep and we provided, they just called me for anything they had. And I felt fortunate and honored that's kind of how my territory grew. And it's not really, I guess, a common thing. It's more just throwing a bunch of darts at the board and see what sticks these days. But anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing that's very important for me is transparency. So, you know, whenever I send a patient to my ortho laser center at Chelmsford, I tell them, I just want you to know, I own this facility with several other doctors in the community. I'm very proud to have done the research. I went to Italy before I decided to buy my first laser and set this whole thing up. I went to Italy to meet with the laser manufacturer, as well as professors from Florence University who were the cellular biologists that were doing the laser studies. I mean, I had to prove it to myself that what I was doing, that I was going to be doing for my patients, will work. And so I'm genuinely very proud to offer this alternative treatment to my patients, having done the research. Once they hear that, the air's cleared, and then they say, okay, doc, if you believe in this, this is something that I'm willing to try. And that relationship has been solid.
Yeah, no, I mean, you bring up a very interesting point. I mean, there's a lot of things that can be done, pre-op, post-op, ways. I mean, I just had Jim Donnelly on last podcast, actually, or 2 podcasts ago. He's the CEO of Restore Hyper Wellness, right? And so they're a very fast-growing franchise. He's all about red light therapy, right? Cryotherapy. I mean, these technologies and the laser seems to be even another step where you're talking about going more in terms of repair and recovery and just kind of like healing. I mean, I, I did not plan on bringing this up, but last July I started a burpee challenge, and it's ridiculous, and I'm too old to be doing this, but I did 200 burpees every day. And so this July I'm now on day 5. I took my wife's birthday off. So I'm on day 5 of 250 a day. And I'm just so sore. It's ridiculous. Again, I don't know why I'm doing this, but these are the types of things when you mentioned Weekend Warrior and just some of these things that people do, whether it's CrossFit or whatever it is, there's technologies that exist that can help us sustain and do these types of things with regularity.
It sounds to me like, Jay, you need TBLT.
What's that?
Total body laser therapy.
Sign me up. Sign me up. I might get a franchise first so that we can do it at my own facility.
There you go. My goodness. I love it. I love it.
Man, we're kind of at that point. I would love if you have anything else that you wanted to maybe ask or say. I mean, I've got a ton of different questions that I had prepared. Maybe one that I actually asked, which is how it rolls,
brother. Organic conversation is always the best from one podcast host to another. I mean, there's probably one more thing that I do like to talk about when it comes to the laser, which not everyone is aware of. But we successfully I donated my laser to the hospital last April in the midst of the crisis for COVID. And we actually used the laser for acute COVID. And we're actually able to, in a very small study, demonstrate the efficacy of laser for acute COVID. We actually cured 4 patients that had significant COVID disease, positive x-rays, severe disease, and over a 4-day treatment process, cleared up their x-rays. They've all done exceptionally well, all no longer have any chronic respiratory issues associated. Their cytokine levels also went down. So that to me was really quite profound. And it's been, our protocols have been validated around the world now. As doctors from around the world have read our paper and are asking for our protocols. I just literally had a doctor from India just send me an email several weeks ago talking about all of the people that he's healed with the laser. And now we're using it for chronic COVID too, for these patients that have this unexplained long hauler chronic COVID disease. Yeah. So we're just trying to get the message out to the, to academic centers that are out there that, hey, grab a laser. Let's see, we can do a larger study here in a clinical trial. I don't think that acute COVID is going away anytime soon. We're only 50%, vaccinated across the country right now. And the chronic COVID players are really looking for help. And we're going to do a clinical trial for them as well. So I just like to message that as well, that there is some positive healing potential.
Well, send me that, whatever data that you have linked to the study, and I'll be sure to put it in the show notes.
Awesome.
I'm on the YouTube, and as soon as I get a logo, I'll be on Spotify and Apple and all that good stuff. But that's awesome. I mean, that's from sparing an opioid, which is an absolute crisis and a pandemic in and of itself, to the COVID. That's impressive.
We need someone other than an orthopedic surgeon managing these pulmonary studies for COVID. So I got to pass the baton on, but I'm waiting. But right now, nobody's picking it up. So I feel like I'm obligated to still do it myself. It's one of those things. It's become a passion. And probably the most difficult thing I've done in my professional practice was getting this laser study across the finish line. So hopefully we'll have somebody pick up the baton.
Congratulations. It's not an easy feat, right? I mean, and I think that you mentioned, going to Nashville and which I think you're right, that the opportunity to gather again is here, right? We've been slowly but surely doing this over the last few months in the spine space and others. But you're right. The industry meetings are right around the corner, right? I'll be at joint sections in late July, AANS and CNS. And there's just a lot of, I think I bring that up to say, like, COVID was a reset year for a lot of folks, right? For you and your team and the other surgeons that went in and went all in on ortho laser. You developed something during this pandemic, right? And now you have it. And as we come back, as we look at that life, I guess, after, it'll be awesome to see kind of where this thing goes. And, maybe these industry events will be opportunities for you to make new connections, spread the good word, and really kind of get the word out. And hopefully this podcast will help in a little bit.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that the direction of social media and the ability to interact is not going to go away. I think there's going to be a hybrid model. We're still going to have society meetings, but we're still going to interact in these types of ways. And I think this is exactly how you message nowadays, is to be able to communicate to as many people as you can.
Yeah, I mean, it's how you grow at scale. I mean, that's what I've been preaching and what I've been trying to do, from a branding perspective, from an awareness perspective, from hey, if you are interested in joining Medtronic, contact me, right? This is, how else could you do that, right? Other than digital. So I believe in it.
Sultan of sales, Sultan of surgery, Sultan of swing. I love it. It's all there. It's all in the brand. It's beautiful.
It's right there. And, one day I think there's Jim Bowling's mentioned that there might be ways to do this, but I'm going to find the, once I get an official logo and kind of make this podcast actually a podcast where it's on Audible, then I'll do the intro music for Dire Straits.
There you go.
Figure out how to do that.
Perfect. I love it.
Wonderful.
Love it.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Sigman. This was rewarding for me, educational. I took a ton of notes. I learned a lot about you, about your mission, kind of what you're doing. If people wanted to find out more, where would you point them?
Yeah, I mean, you can find me pretty much on all social media platforms. Scott A. Sigman MD. Look for me on LinkedIn. Love to have my followers. We're constantly providing really important information about the opioid-sparing movement, about talking about laser, new techniques, also accolades to all of the surgeons and the people across social media that I believe in. The Ortho Show podcast is a great podcast that I'm the host of, where we talk about the stories of people in the orthopedic industry. It's not technical. My mother listens. I make sure that she can understand everything that everybody says, so you don't have to worry about crazy spine technique. It's really just more about, hey, dude, how did you become a spine surgeon and why is this the thing you do? And so that's a great spot. We're on Facebook and Instagram for fun. But at the end of the day, look for me on LinkedIn, follow me on LinkedIn. And it's a pleasure to be able to share everything together.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Scott Sigman, thank you for joining the Sultans of Sales. This is a wonderful way to spend my time, and hopefully you got something out of it too. It's great to meet you in person.
My pleasure, Jay.
Virtual person.
All good.
Yes, sir. Well, enjoy your trip to Nashville. Thanks for everyone for tuning in to the show. We'll see you next week.
All right, brother. Be good.
Cheers.
Take care, everybody.
Thanks, boss. Okay, man. Bye.